The snow fell softly over the bustling streets of Montclair, a small New England town that could have been pulled straight from a Christmas card. Strings of lights adorned every lamppost, and wreaths hung on shop doors. The annual holiday market hummed with cheerful chatter, and the sound of carolers harmonized in the crisp, cold air. Yet, for all its charm, Elliot Prescott felt utterly out of place. Elliot adjusted his scarf against the biting wind and glanced up at the towering Prescott estate. The house, with its stately columns and expansive grounds, was already dressed for the season. Garland wrapped the banisters, and a towering Christmas tree shone in the grand front window. It was the kind of place people stopped to admire, but for Elliot, it felt more like a museum than a home. Inside, the family gathered in the great hall, the room brimming with holiday grandeur. His mother, ever the socialite, mingled with distant cousins and business partners, while his father discussed company profits by the fire. To them, the season wasn't about warmth or togetherness. It was another occasion to showcase their wealth and connections. Elliot stood in the doorway, unnoticed. He wasn't particularly close to anyone in the room, though they were all family. Not since his grandfather had passed away 6 months earlier. Arthur Prescott had been the one constant in Elliot's life, a man who, despite his wealth, had devoted himself to helping others. Arthur's death had left a void that no amount of holiday cheer could fill. "You're sulking," came a voice behind him. It was his cousin, Clara, balancing a glass of champagne in one hand. "What's the matter, Elliot? Don't tell me you're dreading the Prescott Charity Gala." "I'm not dreading it," Elliot replied. It doesn't feel the same anymore." Clara tilted her head, studying him. "Because Grandpa isn't here?" "Because none of this feels real," Elliot admitted. "We host these lavish events, write checks to charities, but it's all for appearances. Grandpa actually cared about people. The rest of us, we just play our roles." Her expression softened for a moment before she shrugged. "Welcome to the Prescott family." The conversation gnawed at him for the rest of the evening. By the time the guests began to filter out and the staff started clearing champagne flutes, Elliot had made up his mind. He wouldn't spend another holiday trapped in this hollow charade. He needed to do something, anything, that felt meaningful. 2 days later, Elliot found himself standing in front of the Children's Medical Center, clutching a form he'd hastily filled out online. A volunteer coordinator greeted him warmly and handed him a red Santa hat. "You'll be shadowing our Santa Claus," she said, leading him down a brightly lit hallway. "Most of the kids love him, and the few who don't, well, you'll figure it out." The pediatric ward buzzed with a different kind of energy. Walls were painted with murals of snowy forests, and Christmas decorations hung from the ceiling. Nurses in festive scrubs pushed carts of hot cocoa, while parents read to their children by bedside trees. It wasn't the holiday grandeur Elliot was used to, but for the first time in years, he felt a flicker of warmth. He followed the coordinator into a common room where a man in a red suit sat in a large chair surrounded by children. A line had formed, each child clutching a wish list or toy. Elliot was given a bag of candy canes to hand out, and as he watched Santa interact with the kids, he began to relax. He might not know what he was doing, but at least he was part of something. That's when he noticed the boy sitting alone at the far end of the room. The child was hunched over a small table, a crayon clutched tightly in his hand as he focused on the paper before him. Unlike the other children, he wasn't laughing or chattering. His dark, solemn eyes were fixed on his drawing. Curious, Elliot made his way over. "Hey there," he said softly. "What are you working on?" The boy glanced up briefly, then went back to his drawing. "It's a house," he said after a pause. Elliot looked closer and felt a strange pang in his chest. The boy had drawn a large mansion under a starry sky, with a family standing in front of it. The details were eerily familiar. The arched windows, the sweeping driveway. It looked like the Prescott estate. "That's impressive," Elliot managed, though his mind was racing. "Do you like to draw?" The boy nodded, but didn't elaborate. He continued shading in the roof, his small hands moving quickly, as if capturing something fleeting. "What's your name?" Elliot asked gently. "Sammy," the boy replied without looking up. "Well, Sammy, you're a talented artist. How did you come up with this house?" "I didn't," Sammy said, finally looking at him. His voice was matter-of-fact, but there was a heaviness behind his words. "I see it in my dreams." Elliot stared at the boy, the world around him fading into the background. Something about Sammy's drawing and his quiet certainty felt like more than coincidence. Elliot couldn't shake the strange sense of familiarity as he stared at Sammy's drawing. The precise lines of the mansion, the way the stars were positioned in the sky, even the faint outline of a tree near the corner. It was all too specific to be random. Yet Sammy, this quiet boy sitting alone in a hospital common room, couldn't possibly have seen the Prescott estate. Elliot knew that much for certain. "That's quite a dream," Elliot said, trying to keep his tone light. "Do you have a lot of dreams like this?" Sammy shrugged, his small shoulders barely moving. "Sometimes. But this one, it's different. It's the same every time. I see the house, and there's a man and a woman. They look happy, like they're waiting for someone." Elliot's throat tightened, and he had to force himself to speak. "Do you know who they are?" Sammy shook his head, focusing again on his drawing. "I don't know their names, but I feel like I should." Elliot crouched down beside him, his curiosity deepening. "What else do you dream about, Sammy?" Sammy glanced at him, his eyes dark and probing, as though deciding whether to trust this stranger in a Santa hat. Finally, he said, "Not much. Just the house. It's nice there. I feel safe." The words hit Elliot harder than he expected. There was something in the boy's voice, an unspoken longing, a quiet ache that resonated with him. He didn't know Sammy's story, but he could tell it wasn't an easy one. Before Elliot could ask more, a nurse approached, her cheerful smile softening as she saw them together. "I see you've met Sammy," she said. "He's quite the artist, isn't he?" "He is," Elliot agreed, standing. "Does he, draw houses often?" The nurse chuckled. "Every chance he gets. It's always the same house, though. We don't know where he gets the idea. Maybe something he saw in a book or on TV." Sammy, oblivious to their conversation, kept coloring the roof of the mansion, his crayon strokes deliberate and careful. Elliot wanted to ask more, but the nurse had already shifted her focus to another child who needed attention. For the rest of his shift, Elliot found himself distracted. The cheerful chaos of the common room, the laughter of children lining up to sit on Santa's lap, all of it blurred into the background as his thoughts circled back to Sammy. There was something inexplicably personal about the boy, as if fate had nudged their paths to cross. But why? Later, as he was leaving the hospital, Elliot paused near the entrance to glance back at the pediatric wing. He could still hear faint echoes of laughter and carols. Sammy's drawing lingered in his mind, vivid and persistent. He thought about asking the hospital staff for more information about the boy, but he wasn't sure how to explain his interest without sounding intrusive. Instead, he tucked the memory away, promising himself he'd return the next day. When Elliot arrived back at the Prescott estate, the grand house felt even colder and more impersonal than usual. He climbed the wide staircase to his room, passing portraits of stern-faced ancestors and landscapes painted in muted tones. His mother had always said the house reflected the family's legacy, but to Elliot, it felt more like a mausoleum. Sitting at his desk, he pulled out his laptop and opened the search engine. For the next hour, he combed through articles and records, typing in combinations of keywords: Sammy, Children's Medical Center, foster care, abandoned child. The results were sparse, mostly unrelated cases or outdated information. Frustrated, he leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. His mind wandered to his grandfather, Arthur Prescott. Arthur had been the heart of the family, a man who believed in using their wealth to make a difference. He'd supported countless charities, funded hospitals, and personally reached out to people in need. Elliot remembered sitting with him as a child, listening to stories about the lives Arthur had touched. "You can always tell when someone needs help, even if they don't say it," Arthur had once told him. "The trick is having the courage to step in." Elliot closed his laptop, the memory filling him with a mix of warmth and resolve. Sammy clearly needed someone to step in. Whether it was the boy's situation, his haunting drawings, or the strange connection Elliot felt, he couldn't ignore it. The next morning, Elliot arrived at the hospital earlier than scheduled. The pediatric wing was quieter, with most of the children still in their rooms. He asked a passing nurse if Sammy was around, and she directed him to a small reading corner at the end of the hall. Sammy was there, seated cross-legged on a beanbag chair, flipping through a worn picture book. He looked up when Elliot approached, his expression unreadable. "Hey, Sammy," Elliot said, crouching to his level. "Mind if I sit with you?" Sammy shrugged, which Elliot took as permission. He settled onto the floor beside the boy, glancing at the book. It was filled with images of houses, small cottages, grand estates, cozy bungalows. Sammy had stopped on a page showing a large, ivy-covered mansion with tall windows and a sweeping lawn. It wasn't an exact match for the house he'd drawn, but it was close. "Do you like houses?" Elliot asked. Sammy nodded. "I like imagining what it'd be like to live in one." Elliot hesitated, then said, "Do you not have a house right now?" Sammy looked away, his small fingers gripping the edges of the book. "I live in a place with other kids. It's fine, but it's not really home." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Elliot felt a pang of guilt for even asking. Here he was, living in a mansion with rooms he didn't even use, while this boy longed for something as simple as a place to belong. "Maybe one day you'll have a house of your own," Elliot said gently. "A place where you feel safe." Sammy glanced at him, his eyes narrowing slightly. "Do you believe that?" "I do," Elliot said firmly, "and I think you deserve it." For the first time, a faint smile flickered across Sammy's face, barely there but unmistakable. It was enough to make Elliot's heart ache. Whatever it took, he knew he had to find out more about this boy and the dreams that connected them. Elliot spent the rest of the day at the hospital, moving through his duties as a volunteer while keeping one eye on Sammy whenever he could. There was something magnetic about the boy, a quiet strength that belied his small frame and soft-spoken demeanor. The more Elliot observed, the more questions he had, but getting answers wasn't easy. Sammy wasn't forthcoming, and the hospital staff, though kind, were bound by privacy rules. By the end of the day, Elliot felt both frustrated and more determined. As he left the hospital, his thoughts raced. Sammy had mentioned living in a place with other kids. That likely meant foster care, but there was something about the boy's certainty when describing the house in his dreams that tugged at Elliot. It wasn't just the familiarity of the drawing. It was the way Sammy spoke about it, as if he'd known it in another life. Back at the Prescott estate, the holiday preparations were in full swing. The staff was busy decorating the grand dining room for the annual Christmas gala, a tradition that Elliot had grown to resent. The event was less about celebrating the season and more about showcasing the family's wealth. As he passed through the room, his mother caught sight of him and called out, "Elliot, darling, there you are. I need you to confirm the guest list," she said, gesturing toward a clipboard. "And please, no surprises this year. Last time, your idea of inviting the youth orchestra created chaos." Elliot barely heard her. His mind was still on Sammy, the boy's face lingering like an unanswered question. "I'll look at it later," he said absently, continuing toward his study. His mother frowned but didn't press the issue. She was used to his lack of enthusiasm for Prescott traditions. Once in the study, Elliot closed the door and opened his laptop again. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, but he started by searching foster care resources in the area. Several organizations popped up, and he jotted down a few names. It was a long shot, but he hoped someone might help him learn more about Sammy's background. The following morning, Elliot called one of the organizations on his list. After a few transfers, he was connected with a social worker named Marlene. Her voice was warm but professional as she listened to his questions. "I understand your concern, Mr. Prescott," Marlene said, "but I'm afraid I can't disclose information about specific children." "I get that," Elliot said, trying to keep the frustration out of his voice. "But this boy, he's special. I think there's more to his story, and I want to help." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Are you saying you'd like to become involved in his life in a more formal way? Possibly as a mentor or even a foster parent?" The suggestion caught Elliot off guard. Foster parent? He hadn't considered anything so official, but as the words settled, he realized the idea didn't feel as far-fetched as it should have. "I'm not sure," he admitted. I need to understand where he comes from." Marlene sighed. The best thing you can do right now is continue spending time with him at the hospital. Build trust. If he wants to share more about himself, he will. It wasn't the answer Elliot had hoped for, but he thanked her and hung up. His resolve hardened. If no one could give him answers, he'd have to find them himself. Over the next week, Elliot returned to the hospital daily, his shifts extending longer than necessary. He helped with activities, handed out candy canes, and even donned the Santa suit once when the regular volunteer couldn't make it. But his real focus was Sammy. Slowly, the boy began to open up, sharing small pieces of his world. Sammy loved to draw, that much was clear. He sketched whenever he had free time, filling pages with everything from animals to landscapes. But no matter what he started, he always returned to the mansion under the stars. Each version became more detailed, as if Sammy were reconstructing it from memory. Elliot watched in quiet fascination, his conviction growing that this wasn't mere coincidence. "Do you ever wonder where your dreams come from?" Elliot asked one afternoon as Sammy worked on another version of the house. "Not really," Sammy said, his voice thoughtful. "They just feel real, like they're trying to tell me something." "Do you think they are?" Elliot pressed. Sammy set his crayon down and looked at Elliot with surprising intensity. "Maybe. I think it's a place I'm supposed to find." The words sent a chill through Elliot. He glanced at the drawing again, his mind racing. What if Sammy wasn't imagining the house at all? What if it was a fragment of his past, something buried so deeply that even Sammy didn't understand its significance? That night, Elliot sat alone in his study, staring at an old photograph of the Prescott estate. It was from decades ago, long before Elliot was born. The house looked much the same, though the grounds were wilder, the gardens less manicured. In the photo, a young woman stood on the front steps, her expression bright and carefree. Elliot recognized her instantly. It was Eleanor Prescott, his father's estranged half-sister. Eleanor had been a taboo subject in the family for as long as Elliot could remember. She'd left, or been forced out, long before he was born, and the details were murky. All he knew was that she'd had a falling out with Elliot's grandfather and never returned. Her name hadn't been mentioned in years, but as he stared at the photo, a possibility took root in his mind. What if Sammy wasn't just some random boy? What if his connection to the Prescott estate wasn't coincidence, but lineage? The idea was as thrilling as it was unsettling. If Sammy was related to Eleanor, it would explain the familiarity of his drawings, the dreams he couldn't explain. But it also raised more questions than answers. How had he ended up in foster care? What had happened to Eleanor? Elliot knew he needed proof before he could act on his suspicions, and that meant digging into the Prescott family's closely guarded history, a task that would undoubtedly ruffle feathers. But as he thought of Sammy's quiet determination, his dreams of belonging, Elliot knew he couldn't let this go. Whatever it took, he would uncover the truth. Elliot spent the next few days obsessively searching through the Prescott family archives. The dusty old library in the estate's West Wing held decades of documents, business records, personal correspondence, and photographs that detailed the family's storied history. Most of it was mundane, but Elliot was focused on one person, Eleanor Prescott. She was an enigma. The youngest daughter of Arthur Prescott's first marriage, Eleanor had been known for her vivacious spirit and defiance of family expectations. According to what little Elliot had heard growing up, she'd been disinherited after a scandal in her 20s and had severed ties with the family. What no one ever talked about was what happened to her afterward. Late one evening, after hours of sifting through old papers, Elliot found something promising. It was a letter, tucked between the pages of a forgotten ledger, addressed to his grandfather. The handwriting was elegant but slightly shaky, as though written in haste. "Dear Father, I know you think I've disgraced the family, but I promise you, I only wanted to follow my heart. I couldn't live under the weight of our name any longer. Please understand, I needed to be free. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, only your understanding. And if you cannot give me that, at least remember me kindly. Eleanor." The letter was undated, but the paper was yellowed with age, and the ink had begun to fade. Elliot read it several times, his mind racing. The tone was final, as if Eleanor had resigned herself to being cut off forever. But where had she gone? And could Sammy somehow be connected to her? Elliot's suspicions grew stronger when he found a second letter, this one addressed to his grandfather's attorney. It mentioned Eleanor's name and referenced a financial disbursement, something small, almost like a severance payment. It was dated over 30 years ago, the last documented trace of her existence. The next morning, Elliot decided to take his search beyond the family archives. He contacted a private investigator, a woman named Grace who had helped the Prescott family in the past. She was discreet and thorough, and Elliot trusted her to dig where he couldn't. "I need you to find out what happened to Eleanor Prescott," he told her over the phone. "Anything you can uncover. Where she lived, who she associated with, if she had children." Grace didn't ask questions, which Elliot appreciated. "Give me a few days," she said. "I'll let you know what I find." In the meantime, Elliot continued volunteering at the hospital. His connection with Sammy deepened, their conversations becoming more natural. Sammy still didn't talk much about his past, but he seemed to enjoy Elliot's company. They spent time drawing together, playing games, and sharing quiet moments in the common room. Elliot could see that Sammy was used to keeping people at arm's length, but every now and then, the boy let his guard down. One afternoon, as they sat together working on a puzzle, Sammy surprised Elliot with a question. "Why do you come here so much?" he asked, his tone curious but not accusatory. Elliot hesitated, caught off guard. "I guess I like being here," he said. "It feels more real than anything else I do." Sammy considered this, his small hands fitting two pieces of the puzzle together. "Your family's really rich, right?" Elliot laughed softly. "Yeah, they are. So why don't you do something fun? Like go on a big vacation or buy a cool car?" Elliot smiled, but there was a sadness behind it. "I guess I'm trying to figure out what's really fun for me. Being here with you. This feels more important than anything money can buy." Sammy didn't respond right away, but Elliot could see the gears turning in his mind. Finally, the boy looked up, his expression serious. "Do you ever feel like you don't belong? Like you're in the wrong place?" The question struck a nerve. Elliot nodded slowly. "I feel that way all the time." Sammy didn't say anything more, but in that moment, Elliot felt an unspoken bond between them. They were both searching for something. Home, purpose, connection, and somehow, they'd found a piece of it in each other. That evening, as Elliot left the hospital, his phone buzzed. It was Grace. "I found something," she said without preamble. Eleanor Prescott lived in a small town about 2 hours from Montclair. She used a different last name, Parker, but I'm certain it's her. She passed away about 8 years ago. Elliot's heart sank. He'd been prepared for the possibility that Eleanor was no longer alive, but hearing it confirmed still hurt. "Did she have a family?" he asked. "Yes," Grace said. "One child, a son. I'm still tracking down more details, but it looks like the boy ended up in foster care after Eleanor died." Elliot's grip on the phone tightened. "A son? Do you know his name?" "Not yet, but I'll have it soon," Grace promised. Elliot thanked her and hung up, his mind racing. Eleanor's son. Could it really be Sammy? The timeline fit, and the foster care connection was too significant to ignore. But if Sammy was his cousin, it raised even more questions. Why had he ended up in the system? Why hadn't the Prescott family been contacted? Elliot spent the next few days in a haze of anticipation, waiting for Grace's next update. In the meantime, he focused on Sammy, cherishing every moment they spent together. If his suspicions were right, this boy wasn't just someone he wanted to help, he was family. Finally, Grace called again. "I've confirmed it," she said. "Eleanor's son is Samuel Parker. He was placed in foster care after her death, and he's been in and out of homes ever since." Elliot felt a mix of relief and anger. Relief that he had an answer, and anger that no one in his family had done anything to help this child. "Thank you, Grace," he said quietly. "This means more than you know." He ended the call and sat in silence for a long moment. Sammy wasn't just a boy with a vivid imagination or a knack for drawing. He was a Prescott, whether he knew it or not. And Elliot was determined to make sure Sammy never felt like he didn't belong again. Elliot couldn't sleep that night. The weight of everything he'd uncovered pressed on him like a heavy blanket, leaving him restless and staring at the ceiling. Sammy was Eleanor's son, his cousin, and yet the boy had been left to navigate a harsh world alone. How had this happened? How had his family, with all their resources, allowed a child of their bloodline to fall through the cracks. By morning, Elliot's frustration had crystallized into determination. He would make this right. He wasn't sure exactly how, but he knew one thing for certain. Sammy deserved more than he'd been given, and Elliot would do everything in his power to give it to him. At the hospital later that day, Elliot found Sammy in his usual spot in the common room, working on another drawing. This time, the paper was filled with stars, dozens of them scattered across a dark sky, glowing against the black crayon strokes. In the corner, Sammy had started sketching the familiar outline of the mansion. Elliot sat down beside him, watching as Sammy carefully added details to the roofline. "That's a lot of stars," Elliot said, his tone light but curious. Sammy glanced at him, then back at the drawing. "They make the house look less lonely." Elliot felt his chest tighten. Sammy's words carried a quiet truth that struck deep. "Do you feel lonely, Sammy?" he asked gently. The boy didn't answer right away. He set his crayon down and studied the drawing, as if searching for the right words. "Sometimes," he said finally, "but it's not so bad when I'm here. When I'm with you." The simple statement left Elliot momentarily speechless. He reached out, resting a hand on Sammy's shoulder. "You're not alone, Sammy. I promise you you're not." Sammy looked up at him, his dark eyes searching Elliot's face. "How do you know?" "Because I'm here," Elliot said firmly. "And I'm not going anywhere." The boy didn't say anything, but his gaze softened, and for a brief moment, Elliot thought he saw a flicker of hope. That evening, Elliot made his way to the hospital's administrative office. He knew the staff couldn't give him much information about Sammy, but now that he had proof of their connection, he hoped they might make an exception. He introduced himself to the head nurse, a kind woman named Diane, and explained as much as he could without overwhelming her. "I've recently learned that Sammy might be a relative of mine," Elliot said. "His mother, Eleanor, was my father's half-sister. I think Sammy is her son." Diane's eyebrows lifted in surprise, but she nodded thoughtfully. "That's quite a discovery. I didn't know Sammy had any family." "Neither did I," Elliot admitted. "But now that I do, I want to help him. I need to know what's possible. Is there a way to, I don't know, take responsibility for him?" Diane's expression softened, but there was hesitation in her voice. "It's not that simple, Elliot. Sammy's situation is complicated. He's technically a ward of the state, and any decisions about his future would have to go through the proper channels. But if you're serious about helping him, I can connect you with his caseworker." "I am serious," Elliot said without hesitation. "I want to do whatever it takes." The next few days were a whirlwind of meetings, phone calls, and paperwork. Elliot met with Sammy's caseworker, a pragmatic woman named Karen who was initially skeptical of his intentions. But as Elliot explained his connection to Sammy and his desire to provide the boy with stability, Karen's skepticism began to fade. "Sammy has been through a lot," Karen said during one of their conversations. "He's a resilient kid, but he needs consistency, someone who can be there for him long-term. Are you prepared for that?" "Yes," Elliot said firmly. "I'm prepared for whatever it takes." Karen nodded, her expression softening. "Then I'll do what I can to expedite the process. But I need to warn you, this isn't going to be easy. Sammy has trust issues, and he's been in and out of homes for most of his life. It's going to take time for him to adjust." "I understand," Elliot said, "but I'm not giving up on him." The hardest part was figuring out how to tell Sammy. Elliot didn't want to overwhelm him or make promises he couldn't keep, but he also felt an urgency to let Sammy know he wasn't alone anymore. One afternoon, as they sat together in the hospital garden, Elliot decided to broach the subject. "Sammy," he began, his voice careful, "I've been learning a lot about you lately. About your past." Sammy looked at him, his expression guarded. "Why?" "Because I care about you," Elliot said, "and I wanted to understand more about where you came from." Sammy's gaze dropped to the ground, his fingers fidgeting with the edge of his sweater. "There's not much to understand." "There's more than you think," Elliot said gently. "Did you know your mom had a brother?" Sammy frowned, clearly confused. "No." "She did," Elliot said. "And that brother, he was my dad. Which means you and I are family, Sammy." Sammy's eyes widened, his face a mix of surprise and disbelief. Family? Like cousins? Exactly, Elliot said with a small smile. You're my cousin, and I think we were meant to find each other. For a long moment, Sammy didn't say anything. He just stared at Elliot, his expression unreadable. Then, slowly, he whispered, "You're not joking?" "I'm not joking," Elliot said. "I'm here because I care about you, and I want to make sure you have everything you need." Tears filled Sammy's eyes, and he quickly wiped them away with the sleeve of his sweater. "No one's ever said that before." Elliot leaned closer, his voice steady. "Well, I'm saying it now. You're not alone anymore, Sammy. You're part of my family, and I'm going to take care of you. I promise." Sammy didn't reply, but he leaned into Elliot's side, his small frame trembling with quiet sobs. Elliot wrapped an arm around him, holding him close. In that moment, he knew without a doubt that he'd made the right decision. Elliot woke the next morning feeling a mixture of relief and determination. The previous day's conversation with Sammy had been one of the most profound moments of his life. For the first time, the boy had opened up, allowing a glimpse of the vulnerable, hopeful child beneath his guarded exterior. But Elliot knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. The promise he had made to Sammy, to take care of him, to give him a family, would require more than words. It would take action, commitment, and, most dauntingly, confronting his own family. Later that day, Elliot met with Karen, Sammy's caseworker, to discuss the next steps. Karen had spent years navigating the bureaucracy of the foster system and knew the hurdles Elliot would face in attempting to become Sammy's guardian. "Are you sure about this?" Karen asked, her tone cautious but not unkind. Taking in a child is a huge responsibility, and Sammy has been through a lot. "He's not going to trust easily." "I'm sure," Elliot said firmly. "I know it won't be easy, but Sammy deserves someone who's willing to fight for him." Karen studied him for a moment, then nodded. "All right, here's what needs to happen. First, we'll need a home study to ensure you're capable of providing a safe and stable environment. Then there's the paperwork, petitions, background checks, financial assessments. It's a process, Elliot, and even if everything goes smoothly, it'll take time." "I'll do whatever it takes," Elliot said. "Just tell me where to start." The process began immediately. Elliot filled out forms, met with attorneys, and prepared for the home visit. He knew his wealth gave him advantages others in his position might not have, but even with those resources, the system was slow. Every delay frustrated him, but he reminded himself that each step was necessary to ensure Sammy's future. As the days turned into weeks, Elliot continued visiting the hospital. Sammy grew more comfortable with him, their bond deepening with every shared moment. They played board games, worked on puzzles, and of course, spent hours drawing. Sammy's sketches of the mansion became more detailed, almost as if he were capturing memories rather than dreams. Elliot wondered if some part of Sammy subconsciously recognized the house as a place he was meant to belong. One afternoon, while they were working on a particularly intricate drawing of the mansion, Sammy looked up at Elliot. "Do you think I'll ever get to live in a house like this?" The question caught Elliot off guard. He paused, choosing his words carefully. "I think you deserve to live somewhere you feel safe and happy. Somewhere that feels like home." Sammy frowned, his small hands gripping the edge of the paper. "What if that never happens?" Elliot reached out, gently resting a hand on Sammy's shoulder. "It will happen, Sammy. I promise you. You're not alone anymore." The boy didn't respond, but the tension in his shoulders eased slightly. Elliot could tell Sammy wanted to believe him, even if years of disappointment had taught him to be wary of promises. As the holidays approached, the hospital held a small Christmas party for the children. Staff and volunteers decorated the common room with tinsel and lights, and Santa Claus made an appearance with gifts for everyone. Elliot watched as Sammy opened his present, a new set of art supplies, and saw the boy's face light up with genuine joy. It was a rare sight, and Elliot felt his heart swell. After the party, as the other children returned to their rooms, Sammy lingered in the common room, carefully organizing his new supplies. Elliot sat beside him, watching as the boy sorted crayons by color. "Did you have fun today?" Elliot asked. Sammy nodded, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, it was nice. They sat in companionable silence for a moment before Sammy spoke again. "Do you think my mom ever celebrated Christmas?" The question was unexpected, and Elliot hesitated before answering. "I think she did. And I think she would have wanted you to have the best Christmas you could." Sammy looked up at him, his dark eyes searching. "Did you know her?" Elliot shook his head. "I didn't, but I've learned a lot about her recently. She was strong, kind, and brave. And I know she loved you very much." Sammy's gaze dropped back to his supplies, and he fiddled with a pencil. "I wish I could remember her." Elliot felt a pang of sadness. "It's okay if you don't. What's important is that she's a part of you, and she always will be." Sammy didn't reply, but Elliot could see the boy processing his words, tucking them away like a small treasure. As Christmas Eve approached, Elliot's determination to bring Sammy home grew stronger. The Prescott family's annual gala loomed, an event Elliot had always dreaded. This year, he had an additional reason to avoid it. He knew his decision to adopt Sammy would be met with resistance, especially from his father, who valued the family's reputation above all else. But Elliot was no longer concerned with maintaining appearances. For the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that far outweighed his family's expectations. The day before the gala, Elliot sat down with his father in the library. The older man was reading the newspaper, his expression as stoic as ever. When Elliot cleared his throat, his father looked up, raising an eyebrow. "What is it, Elliot?" he asked, folding the paper neatly. "There's something I need to tell you," Elliot said, his voice steady. "I've decided to adopt a child." His father's eyes widened in surprise. "Adopt? You?" "Yes," Elliot said. "His name is Sammy, and he's family dad. He's Eleanor's son." The silence that followed was heavy. His father's expression darkened, and he leaned forward, his tone sharp. "Eleanor's son? How did you even find him?" "I've been volunteering at the hospital," Elliot explained. "That's where I met him. He didn't have anyone, Dad. He's been through so much, and he deserves better." His father shook his head, his jaw tightening. "Elliot, this is complicated. You can't just bring a child into the family without considering the consequences. Do you know what people will say?" "I don't care what people say," Elliot said firmly. "This isn't about them. It's about doing what's right." His father's eyes narrowed, but Elliot didn't back down. For the first time, he felt unshakable in his convictions. Sammy wasn't just a child who needed help, he was family. And Elliot was prepared to fight for him, no matter the cost. The Prescott family gala was in full swing, the grand ballroom filled with the glittering lights of crystal chandeliers and the low hum of polished conversation. Guests sipped champagne and exchanged pleasantries, their voices blending with the soft strains of a string quartet. It was the kind of event Elliot had endured countless times before, but this year felt different. As he moved through the crowd, his mind wasn't on the finely dressed guests or the curated displays of wealth. It was on Sammy and the promise he'd made to him. The conversation with his father still rang in his ears. The older Prescott had been resolute in his disapproval, warning Elliot about the repercussions of bringing Sammy into the family. Elliot had left the discussion feeling more determined than ever. His father's fears about public perception meant nothing to him. What mattered was that Sammy felt wanted, safe, and loved. As Elliot navigated the room, his cousin Clara appeared at his side, a knowing look on her face. She sipped her drink, leaning in slightly. "You've been pacing like a man with something to prove," she said lightly. "Care to share?" Elliot gave her a small, wry smile. Clara had always been sharp, her wit often cutting through the superficial atmosphere of these gatherings. "I guess you could say that." She raised an eyebrow. "Does this have anything to do with the child you've been visiting at the hospital? Word gets around, you know." Elliot didn't respond immediately, but the look on his face must have given him away. Clara's expression softened, and she touched his arm. "You're serious about this, aren't you?" "I am," Elliot said, his voice steady. "His name is Sammy, and he's Eleanor's son." Clara blinked in surprise. "Eleanor? You're kidding." "I wish I were," Elliot said. "He's been in foster care since she died. No one in this family did anything to help him, and I'm not letting that continue." Clara was silent for a moment, her gaze thoughtful. Then she nodded. Good. Someone needs to break the cycle in this family. And if anyone can do it, it's you. Her words gave Elliot a boost of confidence, but he knew the hardest part was yet to come. The gala provided an opportunity to address his family directly, to make his intentions clear. He wasn't looking for their approval, but he needed them to understand that this decision wasn't up for debate. Later in the evening, as the guests mingled and the music swelled, Elliot found his father standing near the fireplace, speaking with a group of associates. He approached with purpose, his heart pounding but his resolve unwavering. "Excuse me," Elliot said, his voice cutting through the conversation. The men glanced at him, and his father's expression hardened slightly. "What is it, Elliot?" his father asked, his tone clipped. Elliot squared his shoulders. "I need to say something, and I want everyone here to hear it." The group fell silent, and nearby guests began to take notice. Elliot could feel the weight of their gazes, but he refused to falter. He met his father's eyes, his voice steady as he continued. "I've made a decision to adopt Sammy, Eleanor's son. He's family, and he deserves better than what he's been given. I won't let him be forgotten or ignored, not when I have the ability to change his life." The room was deathly quiet. His father's face darkened, and a murmur spread through the crowd as people exchanged whispers. Elliot braced himself, expecting resistance, but he didn't care. This was about Sammy, not their opinions. "You're making a spectacle of yourself," his father said, his voice low and harsh. "This is not the time or place for such an announcement." "No," Elliot said firmly. "This is exactly the time and place. I've spent my whole life watching this family care more about appearances than people. Well, I'm done with that. Sammy is a Prescott, and he's going to be treated like one." His father's jaw tightened, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering. "Elliot's right," she said. "This family has a history of turning its back on people who need help. Maybe it's time that changed." A ripple of surprise passed through the crowd, and Elliot felt a surge of gratitude for Clara's support. Others began to murmur in agreement, their voices hesitant but growing. Elliot's father glanced around, sensing the shift in the room. He looked back at his son, his expression a mixture of frustration and resignation. "You're determined to do this, aren't you?" "I am," Elliot said, "and nothing you say is going to change my mind." For a moment, his father didn't respond. Then he sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Very well," he said quietly. "Do what you think is best." Elliot felt a wave of relief, though he knew his father's approval was begrudging at best. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Sammy would finally have the family he deserved. The next morning, Elliot returned to the hospital, his heart lighter than it had been in weeks. Sammy was sitting in the common room, working on another drawing. When he saw Elliot, his face lit up with a rare smile. "You're back," Sammy said, setting his crayons aside. "I told you I'm not going anywhere," Elliot said with a grin. He sat beside the boy, pulling a small envelope from his pocket. "I have something for you." Sammy hesitated before taking the envelope. Inside was a photograph of the Prescott mansion, taken years ago. The boy stared at it, his expression a mix of awe and confusion. "That's the house for my dreams," Sammy whispered. "It's real," Elliot said, "and it's waiting for you."
For us.
Sammy looked up at him, tears brimming in his eyes. "You mean it?" "I do," Elliot said. "You're coming home, Sammy." The boy launched himself into Elliot's arms, holding on tightly. For the first time, Elliot felt the weight of his promises lift, replaced by the warmth of a bond he knew would last forever. The drive to bring Sammy home was both exhilarating and nerve-wracking for Elliot. Over the next few weeks, the formalities of the adoption process moved forward, though not without challenges. Background checks, court visits, and evaluations filled his days, each step feeling like a hurdle to clear. But Elliot never wavered. Every time he saw Sammy at the hospital, his determination was renewed. Sammy's quiet smiles and growing sense of trust reminded Elliot exactly why he was doing this. The Prescott estate, so often a symbol of isolation and cold grandeur, began to transform under Elliot's vision. Rooms that had sat empty for decades were cleaned and repurposed. A cozy bedroom with warm colors and shelves for art supplies was prepared for Sammy, and the staff, initially confused by Elliot's sudden focus on a child, began to embrace the idea with quiet enthusiasm. Even Clara pitched in, helping Elliot find just the right pieces to make the space feel like a home rather than another ornate display of wealth. Sammy, though still wary, began to open up more with each passing day. Elliot spent as much time with him as possible, ensuring the boy felt heard and valued. They talked about everything: his favorite cartoons, the books he loved, and the colors he liked to use in his drawings. It was during one of these conversations, as Sammy described the vibrant blues and silvers he imagined for the stars in his sketches, that Elliot realized something. Sammy's dreams weren't just about longing. They were about hope. One afternoon, Elliot brought Sammy a small gift, a set of star-shaped fairy lights for his new room. When he handed them to the boy, Sammy's eyes lit up, and he grinned for the first time. "These are perfect," Sammy said, holding the box tightly. "Thank you." Elliot knelt to meet Sammy's gaze. "You're welcome. I just thought they might make your new room feel like your drawings." Sammy hesitated, then looked up at Elliot with cautious hope. "Do you really think it'll be my room? For real?" "It's already yours," Elliot said firmly. "As soon as you're ready." Sammy didn't say anything, but the way he hugged the box to his chest said everything. Despite the progress they were making, Elliot knew not everyone in the family shared his enthusiasm. His father, though outwardly resigned, remained distant and curt whenever the topic of Sammy arose. Elliot's mother oscillated between polite disinterest and subtle attempts to steer the conversation toward more appropriate family matters. Even some of the extended relatives expressed quiet concern about how the decision might reflect on the Prescott name. Elliot confronted these criticisms head-on during a family dinner shortly before Christmas. The gathering, intended as a celebration of the season, was held in the estate's formal dining room, with its long table, heavy drapery, and towering centerpiece of poinsettias. As the meal progressed, small comments from his relatives began to surface, each more pointed than the last. "Elliot, dear," his mother said at one point, her tone carefully neutral, "are you sure this is the best decision for you? Adoption is quite a commitment." Another relative chimed in, "And so public. It's bound to attract attention, given the family's standing." Elliot set his fork down, his expression calm but firm. "I didn't make this decision for attention. I made it because it's the right thing to do. Sammy is family, and he deserves better than the life he's been given." His father cleared his throat, his expression unreadable. "No one is questioning your intentions, Elliot, but have you considered the long-term implications? This isn't just about charity, it's about responsibility. Are you prepared for that?" "I've thought about it more than you realize," Elliot replied, "and I am prepared. What I'm not prepared to do is let this family continue ignoring its own." A tense silence fell over the room. Clara, seated a few chairs down, finally broke it with a quiet but supportive comment. "I think what Elliot's doing is brave, and it's about time someone in this family started leading with their heart instead of their reputation." Her words seemed to defuse some of the tension, though Elliot knew the battle wasn't entirely won. Still, he left the dinner with his head held high, more convinced than ever that he was on the right path. The day Sammy was discharged from the hospital marked a turning point. Elliot arrived early to help him pack his belongings, which fit neatly into a single bag. The simplicity of it struck Elliot, a stark reminder of how little Sammy had to call his own. But as they left the hospital together, Sammy clutching the star lights in one hand and his bag in the other, Elliot felt an overwhelming sense of purpose. This boy deserved a fresh start, and Elliot was determined to give it to him. When they arrived at the Prescott estate, Sammy was visibly nervous. His small hands fidgeted, and his eyes darted around as they walked through the grand foyer. But as Elliot led him upstairs to his new room, the boy's apprehension began to melt away. The room was everything Elliot had envisioned. Soft, inviting colors adorned the walls, and the bed was covered with a warm, patterned quilt. Art supplies were neatly arranged on a small desk, and the star-shaped lights were already strung up around the window, casting a gentle glow. Sammy stood in the doorway, his eyes wide as he took it all in. "This is mine," he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Elliot smiled and placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's all yours, Sammy. Welcome home." For a moment, Sammy didn't move. Then, slowly, he stepped into the room, running his fingers over the edge of the desk and tracing the quilt on the bed. Finally, he turned to Elliot, his face filled with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. "No one's ever done something like this for me," he said softly. Elliot knelt to meet his gaze. "You deserve it, Sammy. You deserve all of this and more." The boy's eyes filled with tears, but he didn't look away. Instead, he stepped forward and wrapped his arms around Elliot in a tight hug. Elliot held him close, feeling the weight of the moment settle deep in his chest. For the first time in years, the Prescott estate didn't feel cold or empty. It felt like home. The days following Sammy's arrival at the Prescott estate were a whirlwind of adjustments for both him and Elliot. Sammy was quiet at first, exploring the grand house with cautious steps. The size of the mansion seemed to overwhelm him, and he stayed close to Elliot whenever possible, like a shadow afraid to lose its light. Elliot, in turn, made every effort to ease Sammy into his new life, balancing the boy's need for familiarity with the opportunities to grow into this new chapter. Elliot's favorite moments were the small ones. The way Sammy's eyes lit up when he discovered the library, packed with books he could scarcely believe were real, or the quiet satisfaction on his face when he hung his drawings around his room. Each small victory brought a deeper sense of connection between them, a bond Elliot hadn't known he was capable of. But not everyone welcomed the change. The Prescott staff, though polite, struggled to adapt to Sammy's presence. He was a child in a house that had long been devoid of youth, a disruption to their carefully maintained routines. Elliot noticed the hesitant glances and quiet murmurs, but chose to ignore them, focusing instead on Sammy's needs. One morning, as Sammy sat at the breakfast table, absently poking at his pancakes, Elliot decided to address the boy's lingering unease. "How are you settling in?" he asked gently, sitting across from him. Sammy shrugged, his fork tracing patterns in the syrup. "It's okay. It's just big." Elliot smiled. "It is big. A lot bigger than the hospital." "Huh? Yeah." Sammy hesitated, then added, "Sometimes it feels like I don't belong here." The word struck Elliot like a punch, but he forced himself to stay calm. "Why would you think that?" Sammy looked down at his plate. "I don't know. It's just, this place is so fancy and I'm not." Elliot leaned forward, his voice firm but kind. "Listen to me, Sammy. This house isn't what makes you belong here. You belong because you're family. It doesn't matter where you came from or what you've been through. You belong because you're you." Sammy's eyes flicked up to meet Elliot's, searching his face for sincerity. Slowly, he nodded, though Elliot could see the doubt still lingering. To help Sammy feel more at home, Elliot began introducing him to the small joys of the season. They baked cookies in the kitchen, though Sammy mostly ate the dough, and decorated a smaller Christmas tree together in the library, a more personal version of the grand display in the main hall. Sammy's favorite moment came when Elliot brought home a sled, and they spent an afternoon racing down the snow-covered hills behind the estate. Sammy's laughter echoed through the crisp air, pure and unguarded, a sound Elliot realized he hadn't heard nearly enough. Despite the growing warmth between them, Elliot knew there were still challenges to face. His father had been largely absent since Sammy's arrival, retreating to his office or leaving for business trips. Elliot suspected the older man was avoiding the boy, unwilling to confront the reality of Elliot's decision. It frustrated Elliot, but he chose not to press the issue, focusing instead on making Sammy feel secure. One evening, as they sat by the fire in the library, Sammy surprised Elliot with a question. "Did my mom ever live here?" Elliot paused, considering how best to answer. "She did, a long time ago. Before I was born." Sammy leaned back in his chair, his small hands clutching a blanket draped over his lap. "What was she like?" Elliot hesitated. He'd never met Eleanor, only pieced together fragments of her story through family whispers and his own research. But he wanted Sammy to have a connection to her, even if it was built from the pieces he'd gathered. "She was brave," Elliot said finally. "She didn't let anyone tell her how to live her life. She loved deeply and wasn't afraid to fight for what she believed in." Sammy stared into the fire, his face unreadable. "Do you think she'd like me?" Elliot's heart ached at the question. He reached over, resting a hand on Sammy's shoulder. I don't think she'd just like you, Sammy. I think she'd be proud of you. The boy didn't respond, but he leaned into Elliot's touch, the weight of his small frame pressing against him. In that quiet moment, Elliot felt a profound sense of purpose. He wasn't just giving Sammy a home. He was giving him a place to heal, to grow, to rediscover the love he'd lost. As Christmas approached, Elliot decided to do something special. He enlisted Clara's help to organize a surprise for Sammy, something that would tie the boy's dreams to reality. On Christmas Eve, as snow blanketed the grounds, Elliot led Sammy to the front door, where a horse-drawn sleigh waited. Sammy's eyes widened in wonder. Is this for us? It's for you, Elliot said with a grin. Come on, let's take a ride. They climbed into the sleigh, and as the horses pulled them through the snowy landscape, Sammy's face lit up with pure joy. The stars above sparkled like the ones in his drawings, and for the first time, the boy seemed completely at ease. As they returned to the estate, Sammy turned to Elliot, his voice soft. This is the best Christmas I've ever had. Elliot smiled, his chest tight with emotion. It's just the beginning, Sammy. There's so much more ahead. That night, as Sammy fell asleep in his new room, surrounded by the soft glow of the star-shaped lights, Elliot stood in the doorway, watching him. The house, so often cold and silent, felt alive for the first time in years. Sammy's presence had filled a void Elliot hadn't even realized was there, and in giving the boy a home, Elliot had found a sense of belonging he'd been searching for all his life. For the first time in as long as he could remember, the Prescott estate truly felt like a family home. Christmas morning arrived quietly, the soft glow of dawn casting a golden light over the snow-covered grounds of the Prescott estate. Elliot woke early, his heart light as he prepared for the day. This Christmas wasn't about grandeur or appearances. It wasn't about impressing anyone or fulfilling family expectations. This year, it was about Sammy. He carried a tray of hot cocoa and warm pastries upstairs, pausing briefly outside Sammy's room. The faint hum of holiday music from the hallway speakers added a sense of calm to the morning. Gently, Elliot knocked and then opened the door. Sammy was already awake, sitting cross-legged on his bed, a book of Christmas stories open in his lap. The star-shaped light strung around the room gave everything a warm glow. "Merry Christmas," Elliot said, stepping inside with the tray. Sammy looked up, his face breaking into a smile. "Merry Christmas." Elliot set the tray down on a small table and sat beside the boy. "Did you sleep well?" Sammy nodded, glancing at the tray. "Is that for me?" "Of course," Elliot said. "Thought we'd start the day with something cozy before opening presents." Sammy hesitated, as if unsure how to respond to the gesture. "I've never really done Christmas like this before." "Well," Elliot said, handing him a mug of cocoa, "this year, we're doing it right. Together." Sammy took a sip, his hands cradling the mug. For a moment, they sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes when two people feel completely at ease with one another. After breakfast, they made their way downstairs to the living room, where a modest pile of gifts waited beneath the tree. Unlike the elaborate displays of past years, the focus this time was on simplicity and meaning. Clara arrived shortly after, her arms laden with more gifts, her laughter filling the room as she teased Elliot about his inability to wrap presents properly. Sammy sat cross-legged on the floor, his face lighting up with every unwrapped gift: a set of drawing pencils, a soft sweater, a book of star maps. But the last box, a large one wrapped in blue paper, made him pause. "What's this?" Sammy asked, glancing at Elliot. "Open it and see," Elliot said with a smile. Carefully, Sammy tore away the paper, revealing a wooden art easel with a drawer full of paints and brushes. He stared at it, his hands hovering over the smooth wood, as if unsure it was real. "For your room," Elliot said. "I figured you might want a place to keep creating your masterpieces." Sammy looked up at him, his eyes brimming with emotion. This is too much." "It's not too much," Elliot said gently. "You deserve this, Sammy. All of it." The boy hesitated for a moment, then leaned forward and hugged Elliot tightly. Elliot wrapped his arms around him, holding him close. "Clara, watching from the couch, wiped at her eyes with a smile. As the morning stretched into afternoon, the house buzzed with a warmth it hadn't known in years. Clara stayed for lunch, and the three of them shared stories, laughter, and the kind of connection that transcended the material trappings of the Prescott name. Elliot couldn't remember a time when the estate had felt so alive, so genuinely full of joy. Later, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Elliot took Sammy for a walk in the garden. The snow crunched beneath their boots, and the cold air painted their cheeks pink. Sammy held onto Elliot's hand, his small fingers gripping tightly. "Elliot?" Sammy asked after a while. "Yeah. Do you think my mom would have liked it here? The house, I mean." Elliot stopped walking, kneeling in front of Sammy so they were eye to eye. "I think she would have loved it, Sammy. And I think she would have loved seeing you here, happy and safe." Sammy nodded, his gaze distant. "I wish I could have known her." "I know," Elliot said softly, "but I think she'd be really proud of you. And I think she'd be happy knowing you're with family now." For a moment, Sammy didn't say anything. Then he wrapped his arms around Elliot's neck, holding on as if afraid to let go. Elliot hugged him back, his heart swelling with love and gratitude. As they walked back to the house, Elliot glanced at the stars beginning to appear in the evening sky. Sammy's dreams, his drawings, his hopes, they all seemed to align in that moment, as if the universe had conspired to bring them together. For the first time in years, Elliot felt a sense of peace, a certainty that he was exactly where he was meant to be. That night, after tucking Sammy into bed, Elliot sat by the fire in the library, reflecting on everything that had brought them to this point. The challenges, the doubts, the resistance from his family. All of it seemed insignificant compared to the bond he'd built with Sammy. The boy wasn't just a part of his life now. He was his family, his purpose, his second chance to create something meaningful. Elliot glanced up as Clara entered the room, a glass of wine in her hand. She sank into the chair opposite him, smiling warmly. "You did good today," she said. "Sammy's happy. I can see it." Elliot nodded, his own smile soft. "He's changed everything, you know. This house, this family." Clara raised her glass in a small toast. "To Sammy, and to you, for finally showing us all what family is supposed to mean." Elliot clinked his glass against hers, the warmth of the moment settling deep in his chest. For the first time in years, he felt like he belonged, not to the Prescott legacy, but to something far greater. He belonged to a family built on love, resilience, and the simple, profound joy of being there for one another. And as the stars outside shimmered against the dark sky, Elliot knew that this Christmas was only the beginning. Together, he and Sammy would build a future as bright as the lights that now filled the once lonely house. They were home, at last.